The attic of the Harris family home had always been a place of mystery for Emily Harris. It was a space steeped in dust and forgotten memories, where old trunks and wooden crates seemed to whisper stories of the past. At 17, Emily was a self-proclaimed history nerd, the kind of girl who got lost in family photo albums and old journals while her friends were glued to their phones. The attic was her sanctuary, a portal to the world of what once was. On this particular summer day, the attic was even hotter than usual, the air thick and oppressive as the sun beat down on the roof above. Emily wiped her brow and pushed aside a stack of old quilts, determined to find something new, something no one in the family had thought about in years. "Emily, lunch is ready," her mom called from downstairs. "Just a few more minutes." Emily shouted back, her voice muffled by the insulation. It was then that she saw it, a wooden box hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The box was small, its surface intricately carved with floral designs, though years of neglect had left its brass hinges tarnished. Emily's curiosity flared. She pulled the box free and sat cross-legged on the attic floor, brushing away the cobwebs. The lid creaked open, revealing a trove of delicate keepsakes. There were faded photographs, a dried flower pressed between pages of an old book, and at the very bottom, a small leather-bound diary. Its cover was cracked and worn, the corners frayed, but it had a certain elegance to it that caught Emily's breath. Turning the fragile pages, she saw the first entry written in careful, looping script. March 3, 1952. "My name is Ruth." The name struck a chord. Ruth Harris. Emily's great-grandmother. Her heart raced as she skimmed through the diary, the scent of lavender rising faintly from its pages. Ruth's entries painted a vivid picture of a life Emily had never imagined. They spoke of afternoons spent by the river, secret laughter shared with a girl named Grace, and dreams of a world far beyond the boundaries of their small southern town. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Ruth wrote about the strict rules her parents imposed, their warnings against mingling with the wrong kind of people. Emily felt a chill as she read further, the tension in Ruth's words growing with each entry. Finally, she came to a passage dated August 17, 1954. "They found out. They threatened Grace's family, and now they're leaving town. I don't know how to make this right. I don't know if I'll ever see her again." Emily sat back, the diary resting in her lap. The words lingered in her mind, heavy with regret and unanswered questions. Who was Grace? What had happened between her and Ruth? And why had no one in the family ever mentioned her before? With the diary clutched tightly in her hands, Emily climbed down from the attic, her mind already made up. She had to know the truth. Emily descended from the attic carefully, clutching the diary as though it were a fragile treasure. Dust coated her arms, and her hair was flecked with cobwebs, but she didn't care. Her mind was racing with the possibilities hidden in the pages she'd just read. By the time she reached the kitchen, her mom was setting plates on the table, the scent of fried chicken filling the air. "You look like you've been wrestling with a ghost," her mom teased, glancing at the grime on Emily's clothes. "Maybe I have," Emily replied, holding up the diary. Her mom's playful smile faded. "What's that?" "It's a diary," Emily said, sliding into a chair. "It belonged to Ruth." Her mom froze mid-step, the color draining from her face. "Where did you find it?" "In the attic," Emily answered, flipping open the cover to the first page. "Why didn't anyone tell me about Grace Williams?" Her mom's eyes darted to the diary, then back to Emily. "Grace Williams? What are you talking about?" "She's all over this," Emily said, tapping the book. "She and Ruth were close. Really close. Then something happened, and Grace's family had to leave town." "It sounds bad, Mom." Her mom sat down across from her, her expression troubled. "I don't know much about it. Your grandma Margaret might, though." Ruth didn't talk about her younger years much. Emily frowned. "But why? Was it that painful? Her mom hesitated. Ruth had a strong sense of duty. She probably felt like it wasn't her story to tell, or that people wouldn't understand. But I want to understand, Emily said. This isn't just history, it's our family. It's her. And Grace. I need to know what happened. Later that afternoon, Emily drove over to her grandmother Margaret's house. Margaret was Ruth's daughter, and though she was in her late 70s, she was as sharp as ever. Her home was filled with mementos, framed photographs, antique furniture, and bookshelves crammed with history books. Emily found her in the sunroom, knitting a scarf while classical music played softly in the background. "Hi, Grandma," Emily said, stepping inside. Margaret looked up, her face lighting with a smile. "Emily. What brings you here, sweetheart?" Emily held up the diary. "This." The smile faded. Margaret put down her knitting, her hands resting on her lap. "Where did you get that?" "In the attic," Emily replied, sitting across from her. "I was looking through some old stuff, and I found it." "Have you read it?" Margaret shook her head. "No. My mother never let anyone read her diaries. She was very private about her past." "Well, I've read it," Emily admitted. "And there's something in here I need to know about. Grace Williams." At the name, Margaret's expression grew guarded. "What did the diary say about her?" Emily opened one of the entries. "Grace was my best friend," she read aloud. "She and I spent hours at the river, dreaming of a better world. But I know my parents wouldn't approve if they found out." Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze distant. "I knew they were friends. Mama told me once, a long time ago. She said Grace was like a sister to her. But times were different then, Emily. Their friendship wasn't something people accepted. When my grandparents found out, it caused a lot of trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Emily pressed. Margaret hesitated. "My grandfather threatened Grace's family. Said he'd ruin them if they didn't leave town. So they left." Emily's stomach sank. "But why? Why would he do that?" Margaret shook her head. "Because he was a proud man. Too proud, too concerned with what people thought. Mama always regretted it. She blamed herself for not standing up to them." Emily's voice softened. "Did she ever try to find Grace? To apologize?" Margaret's eyes glistened. "She wanted to. But by the time she worked up the courage, too many years had passed. She didn't even know where to start looking." Emily closed the diary and leaned back, her mind racing. "I want to find her, Grandma. I want to find Grace." Margaret's lips parted in surprise. "Emily, that was over 70 years ago. She might not even be alive." "Then I'll find her family," Emily said firmly. "Her story shouldn't end like this. Ruth didn't get the chance to make it right, but maybe I can." Margaret studied her granddaughter, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You have your great-grandmother's stubbornness, that's for sure. If anyone can find Grace's story, it's you." That evening, Emily sat on her bed with Ruth's diary in her laptop, determined to find a lead. She typed "Grace Williams 1954" into a search engine, but the results were overwhelming, thousands of entries, most of them irrelevant. She narrowed her search to local archives, focusing on records from the small town Ruth had mentioned in her diary. After hours of digging, she found an old census document listing the Williams family, Grace's parents, her two younger siblings, and Grace herself. They had left town in 1954, just as Ruth had written, and moved to Birmingham, Alabama. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had a destination. Emily had always imagined herself as a modern-day explorer, digging through the past to uncover its hidden stories. But this journey felt different. Personal. The diary's delicate pages had bridged the decades, connecting her to Ruth's guilt and Grace's forgotten story. The drive to Birmingham took 5 hours. Her grandmother had insisted on packing snacks and water, and Emily's parents had given her the usual lecture about being safe. But her heart raced with anticipation as she passed the highway sign marking the city limits. Birmingham was a place steeped in history, its streets lined with a mix of old red brick buildings and sleek, modern architecture. The air seemed to hum with the echoes of marches, protests, and voices that had once cried out for change. Emily's first stop was the public library, where she hoped to find local archives. The building was enormous, its walls lined with shelves that seemed to stretch into eternity. She approached the information desk, where a cheerful librarian greeted her. "Hi," Emily began, clutching her folder of notes. "I'm looking for records from the 1950s, specifically about a family named Williams. They moved here around 1954. The librarian tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's a tall order, but we have some digitized city directories and census records you can search through. Follow me." Emily spent hours combing through the database, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she scrolled through pages of names. Finally, she found it, a listing for the Williams family in a 1955 directory. They had lived in a modest neighborhood near downtown Birmingham. Her pulse quickened as she jotted down the address. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Emily drove to the address listed in the directory. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street and elderly couples sat on porches sipping iced tea. But the house she was looking for no longer stood. In its place was a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds and bordered by a sagging chain-link fence. Emily stood at the edge of the property, clutching Ruth's diary, as disappointment settled over her. "This can't be it," she muttered. "Looking for something?" The voice startled her, and she turned to see an older man walking toward her. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a small gardening spade. Yeah," Emily said, tucking the diary under her arm. "I'm trying to find someone who used to live here. The Williams family." This was their address in the 1950s. The man frowned, leaning on his spade. "Williams? That's going back a ways. I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, though. I might have known M." Emily's breath caught. "Do you remember Grace Williams?" The man scratched his chin. "Grace, yeah, I remember her. Quiet girl, real smart. Her family moved here from out of town. She went to Carver High, if I'm not mistaken. Do you know what happened to her?" Emily asked eagerly. He nodded. "She moved away after graduation. Got involved in the civil rights movement, I think. Haven't heard her name in years." "Thank you," Emily said, her mind spinning. "Do you know anyone who might remember more?" The man gestured down the street. "Miss Eleanor. She's lived here longer than I have. If anyone knows, it's her." Miss Eleanor's house was a time capsule of the 1950s. Its front porch was lined with flowerpots, and wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze. When Emily knocked, an elderly woman answered, her eyes sharp and curious. "Can I help you?" Miss Eleanor asked. "My name's Emily Harris," she began. "I'm trying to learn about Grace Williams. Someone said you might know her." Miss Eleanor's face softened at the name. Grace Williams. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a long time. She opened the door wider. "Come on in, honey." Inside, the house was cozy and filled with photos of smiling families. Emily sat on a floral-patterned sofa while Miss Eleanor poured sweet tea into delicate glass cups. "So, what's your connection to Grace?" Miss Eleanor asked, settling into an armchair. Emily hesitated, then pulled out Ruth's diary. "She was friends with my great-grandmother, Ruth Harris. They grew up together in Mississippi. I found this diary in our attic, and it talks about Grace a lot. I want to know what happened to her." Miss Eleanor took the diary, her fingers tracing its worn cover. Ruth and Grace were close, weren't they? Grace talked about her sometimes, back when we were kids. Emily leaned forward. You knew her? Miss Eleanor nodded. We went to school together. Grace was the smartest girl in our class. Always had her nose in a book, but she had a kind heart. After her family moved here, they struggled a bit at first, but Grace never let it get her down. What happened to her after high school? Emily asked. Miss Eleanor's gaze turned wistful. She got involved with the civil rights movement. Marches, sit-ins, you name it. She was fearless. Last I heard, she moved to Atlanta to work with an organization there. Emily's heart swelled with hope. Do you think she's still alive? Miss Eleanor smiled gently. If anyone could make it through all these years, it's Grace. She's stronger than most people I've ever known. The next morning, Emily sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, her laptop open and pages of notes spread out around her. Miss Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. She moved to Atlanta to work with an organization there. Emily had spent the night researching civil rights organizations in Atlanta during the 1960s. The list was long, activism had thrived in the city, and Grace could have worked with any number of groups. Emily felt a deep admiration for this woman she'd never met, someone who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice in a time when doing so could cost you everything. Any luck yet? Her grandmother Margaret asked as she walked into the room. I've narrowed it down, Emily replied, tapping her pen against her notebook. There's a good chance Grace was connected to the Southern Leadership Council. A lot of the women involved in the marches ended up working with them in Atlanta. Margaret placed a cup of tea in front of Emily and sat down. Do you really think you'll find her after all these years? Emily looked up, her eyes bright with determination. I have to try. She meant so much to Ruth, and Ruth never got the chance to make things right. This feels important. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Emily's hand. If anyone can do it, it's you. The drive to Atlanta was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. Emily had never been to the city before, and as the skyline came into view, she felt a mixture of awe and anticipation. The streets buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the quiet neighborhoods she was used to. Her first stop was the Southern Leadership Council's Archive Center. Housed in a historic brick building, the center was a treasure trove of records, photographs, and oral histories documenting the civil rights movement. Emily introduced herself to the archivist, a kind woman named Dr. Angela Monroe. I'm looking for information about someone who might have worked with your organization in the 1960s, Emily explained. Her name is Grace Williams. Dr. Monroe's brow furrowed in thought. Grace Williams, that name sounds familiar. Give me a moment. Emily followed her into a back room filled with filing cabinets and shelves of neatly labeled boxes. Dr. Monroe pulled out a folder labeled Community Organizers and flipped through its contents. Here we go, she said, pulling out a black and white photograph. She handed it to Emily, who stared at the image in amazement. It was Grace. She looked older than in Ruth's descriptions but carried herself with the same quiet confidence. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, and she wore a smart blouse and skirt, her expression both serious and kind. That's her, Emily whispered. She was incredible, Dr. Monroe said. Grace was one of our most dedicated organizers. She worked on voter registration drives, literacy programs, and community outreach. I think she stayed with us until the early 1970s. Do you know where she went after that? Emily asked. Dr. Monroe flipped through a few more pages. It looks like she moved to Macon to take care of a family member. After that, we lost track of her. Emily's heart sank. The trail was growing colder, but she wasn't ready to give up. Thank you so much for this, Emily said, carefully tucking the photograph into her folder. It means a lot. Dr. Monroe smiled warmly. Good luck finding her. And if you do, tell her we still remember her work." Emily spent the next few days in Macon, following every lead she could find. At the public library, she unearthed a reference to Grace in an old newspaper article. The piece mentioned her involvement in a literacy program for underprivileged youth and listed her address at the time. When Emily arrived at the address, she found a small, neatly kept house with a faded mailbox that read Williams. Her heart raced as she climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman answered, her expression wary. "Can I help you?" Emily hesitated. "I'm looking for Grace Williams. Does she live here?" The woman's face softened. "She does. She's my mother. Can I ask what this is about?" Emily felt a rush of relief. "My name is Emily Harris. I think your mother was friends with my great-grandmother, Ruth Harris, a long time ago. I've been looking for her because I wanted her to know that Ruth never forgot her." The woman studied Emily for a moment, then nodded. "Come in." The living room was cozy, filled with family photos and bookshelves lined with old paperbacks. Emily's eyes darted around, taking in the space that had been home to the woman she'd been searching for. "Wait here," Grace's daughter said before disappearing down a hallway. A few moments later, she returned with an older woman whose presence filled the room. Grace Williams was in her 80s now, her hair silver and her movements slower, but her eyes were sharp and full of life. "You're Ruth's great-granddaughter?" Grace asked, her voice warm but tinged with surprise. Emily nodded, standing to greet her. "Yes, ma'am. I found Ruth's diary, and it talked about you, about how much you meant to her. I thought you should know." Grace's eyes glistened with tears as she lowered herself into a chair. "Ruth," she murmured, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. "I never thought I'd hear her name again." Emily sat across from her, clutching Ruth's diary. She always regretted what happened. She wanted to find you, but she didn't know how. I think she was ashamed. Grace nodded slowly. "It wasn't her fault. We were just girls, caught in a world that didn't understand us. But I've thought about her every day since I left." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the diary. Emily passed it to her carefully, watching as the older woman ran her fingers over the worn leather cover. For a moment, Grace simply held it, her eyes distant, as if the years between her and Ruth were falling away. "She always carried this with her," Grace said softly. "Even back then, she'd write everything down. Her dreams, her worries, even the little moments we thought no one else would care about." Emily smiled. "That sounds like her. I've spent so much time reading it that I feel like I know her better now than I did before." Grace opened the diary and flipped through the pages, pausing at an entry dated July 12, 1954. "Grace and I sat by the river today. She told me about her dreams of becoming a teacher, and for a moment, I could see it so clearly, her standing in front of a classroom, inspiring the next generation. I told her she could do anything, and she laughed like I was the crazy one. But I meant it. She's the strongest, smartest person I've ever known." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she read. "She believed in me when no one else did," she said, her voice breaking. "Even when the world told us we weren't supposed to be friends, Ruth stood by me. Until..." Her words trailed off, and she closed the diary gently, holding it in her lap. Emily leaned forward, her heart aching for this woman who had carried so much in silence. "Until they made you leave," Emily finished for her. Grace nodded. "Your great-grandfather was a powerful man in that town. When he threatened my family, my parents didn't see any other choice. They wanted to protect me, but leaving felt like losing a piece of myself. Ruth and I never got to say a proper goodbye." Emily hesitated, then reached into her bag. She pulled out the photograph from the archives and handed it to Grace. "I found this in the Southern Leadership Council's records," Emily said. "You did so much, Grace. You made a difference. Grace stared at the photograph, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. I tried, she said. After we left Mississippi, I realized I couldn't just sit back and accept the way things were. I joined the movement because I didn't want anyone else to lose what Ruth and I lost. But even then, I never forgot her. Emily spent the next few hours talking with Grace, listening to her stories about the civil rights marches, the literacy programs she'd organized, and the friendships she'd forged along the way. Grace's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her memories coming alive with each word. But what struck Emily most was the way Grace still spoke about Ruth, not with bitterness, but with warmth and gratitude. She gave me hope, Grace said. Even when the world tried to take it away, Ruth's belief in me kept me going. I wish I could have told her that. Emily's chest tightened. I think she knew, she said. But now, I can tell her story. I can make sure people remember both of you, not just what you lost, but what you stood for. Grace's eyes glistened. That means more to me than you'll ever know. Before Emily left, Grace handed her a small envelope. Take this, she said. It's a letter I wrote to Ruth years ago but never sent. I think it's time it found its way back to your family. Emily nodded, promising to deliver it to her grandmother Margaret. I'll make sure this story doesn't end here, she said. Grace smiled. You've already done so much, Emily. Thank you for bringing her back to me. As Emily drove back home, the weight of the past felt lighter somehow. She knew Ruth and Grace's story was far from over. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, love and friendship could leave a mark that time couldn't erase. Back in Pine Creek, Emily sat with Margaret on the porch, the summer breeze carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. She handed her grandmother the letter Grace had given her, watching as Margaret unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The letter was brief but heartfelt, written in Grace's elegant handwriting. Dear Ruth. You were my light when everything seemed dark. I've carried your kindness and strength with me every day since we parted. I hope you found happiness and peace, because you deserve nothing less. Thank you for being my friend. Always. Grace. Margaret wiped her eyes as she finished reading. She never forgot her, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Neither will we, Emily replied. The Harris family decided to include Grace and Ruth's story in the town's historical archives, ensuring that future generations would learn about their friendship and the challenges they faced. Emily worked with local historians to preserve Ruth's diary and Grace's contributions to the civil rights movement. At the dedication ceremony, Emily stood alongside Grace, who had traveled to Pine Creek for the first time in decades. The two women hugged, their connection a living testament to the power of reconciliation and the enduring impact of shared stories. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time to explore this fascinating story with us. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us, and God bless us all.